Why don't we hit record if we already haven't? All right, I'm going to call this meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization.
So are they
and Finance Committee to order. I will read the notice of non-discrimination. Do we do a roll call first to establish a quorum, or do we just keep going?
We do it during the introduction slide, Mr. Chair.
There you go. Thank you. There's so many different organizations that we do this for. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender. But if you listen to the band Creed, you cannot participate. Gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender, identity or expression, veteran status or background. We have to draw the line somewhere, and the band Creed is it. You can read the full notice of your rights and protections at www.bostonmpo.com/MPO_non-discrimination. All right, next slide, please. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to fully participate in this meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact the Erin McGuire, MPO staff at emaguire@ctps.org, via phone at 857-702-3681, or you can use the Zoom chat box. Meeting guidelines. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After the roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Please always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking either the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raised hand button at the bottom, or in the reactions button in the toolbar. I will then call on participants as I see you, and if you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. I believe next is introductions. Yes, Silva, do you want to call the roll?
Yes, sure. MBTA Advisory Board.
Brian Kane, present.
City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti.
MAPC.
Good morning, Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Larry Dickens Advisory Council here.
City of Boston. And MassDOT.
Yep, Derek Cravat here from MassDOT Planning.
That's roll, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Silva. We have a quorum. We'll move on to public comments. Does anybody have a public comment? Perry or Brad, you can use the raise hand function and we'd be delighted to hear from you, or anybody that's here. Okay, seeing no hands, I will close the public comment period. We'll move on to item 3, our first action item, which is a summary of the November 16th, 2023 meeting, which has been posted. Is there a motion to approve?
Eric Barrasso, I'll make a motion to approve.
Is there a second? Thanks, Eric.
Dickens will second.
He beat you, Derek. Len will second. Silva, call the roll, please.
Brian Kane.
Yes.
Dennis Giambetti.
Dennis Giambetti here.
Eric Barrasso.
Eric Barrasso, yes.
Leonard Diggins.
Dickens, yes.
Derek Cravat.
Derek Cravat, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Silva. We'll now move on to our fourth item, which is the Executive Director Goals Update from Tegan Tyke. Tegan, take it away, please.
Thanks, Brian. So I am going first today before talking about the budget. As I have twice before this year, I'm going to be offering some updates, and I've been doing this roughly quarterly on progress towards the goals that I established in my annual review. Next slide, please. So this is this shows the overview of the process. We're actually in the process now of carrying out the review and setting goals for state fiscal year 2025, which starts on July 1. It happens May through July when I submit my self-assessment, which I did about a week or week and a half ago. And then I will meet with the review team to discuss and finalize the assessment, and then begin, and that'll happen in June, that's scheduled for June. And then we begin the next state fiscal year in July, and I, along with all of the MPO staff, have adjusted salaries based on merit increases that are then valid throughout the July year. And then I would start reporting quarterly to this committee on the goals that I established in that review. So this is the first time I'll be doing my self-assessment and talking with the review team in the context of knowing that we'll be doing these quarterly reports, because those were established in the operations plan, which was approved last November. And also last November, we established that the evaluation team for the review would be 3 individuals. Those are the representative of the MPO chair, which is the designee, and David Mueller plays that role for MassDOT, the Office of Transportation Planning, the seat for the vice chair and also the fiduciary agent, and that's Mark Trayson from Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And then also we have added in the operations plan the chair of the A&F committee, this committee, Brian Kane, representative from the MBTA Advisory Board. So those 3 make up my review team for the evaluation process. Next slide, please. So again, this is the 3rd time this year we'll be discussing progress towards the state fiscal year 2024 goals for the agency, which I had organized into categories that align with the agency's strategic plan goal areas. And my updates today will mirror those that were shared in a memo that's been posted to the MPO calendar. So you can also read through the memo if you haven't already, and there's more details in that memo. So I'll try to provide just brief updates in these category areas, these 5 areas. Next slide, please. Great. So we've talked a lot about employee experience and retention, and in these last several months, we've added, well, we've actually had 3 more full-time positions accepted, offers accepted. They'll be coming on, some of them are coming on in June and July. And we also had 3 data collector positions filled. The full-time positions that have been filled are the human resource and operations coordinator, an assistant planner, and a transportation planner, which is also the program manager for the congestion management program. So with those hires in the full-time positions, as well as 2 retirements, we are still at a full-time staff count of 54, which is lower than what the target staffing level was for the year. That has been working out in a sense that some of the revenue streams that we were expecting this year also yielded less than expected results. So as you'll see, the budget is balanced with only a slight surplus relative to the expenses with the staffing level. And given that, and given how much fluctuation we see from the year, in the next state fiscal year, I'll move away from having a goal that is specifically targeting a number of staff, and instead focus more on the work that we're trying to accomplish, just because I think that's a more meaningful goal to have and to work towards. The next bullet on the I can pause if there are questions.
So maybe you answered it with that, what you just said, because I was wondering if the revenue stream was affected by the amount of staff, but it seems to me what you're saying is that the revenue stream kind of fluctuates on its own, and it's good for you to be able to adapt to the amount of staff that you have,
Yeah, it's pretty balanced this year. In past years, what the concern can be is if we have lower staffing levels than we need to do, than we want to do our work, we could potentially be leaving available funding on the table, meaning that we don't actually do all of the work that we could do with the federal funds that are available. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about accessing and using deobligated PL funds. And that happens when we have planning funds that come from the feds and are allocated to MPOs, and we maybe don't have enough staff to actually use or allocate all of those planning funds in a given year. And that can leave a balance of money on the table that we might want to try to use in future years. So that can happen, but that's not something that we're expecting to see this year. This year, I think we're seeing more of a balance of spending down or spending out the funding that's available to us. So it really is, there's so many factors because salary levels kind of affect how much of the revenue we use. We have the planning funds are only about 3/4 of the revenues that we expect to come in. And so if other revenue sources come in a bit lower than we expected, it kind of balances out. So I don't know if that answers your question, Len, or gives you a sense that there is a lot of kind of ebb and flow or movement.
Yeah, it does mean, but I'll come back with some other follow-up and let you continue on with the presentation. I'm sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
Okay, no, absolutely, that's fine. Okay, so I think The next bullet is around the orientation process on this particular slide. So with many thanks to the hard work of sorry, my cat just joined me by breaking through the door while we're in a meeting. With many thanks to the hard work of the Deputy Executive Director, as well as our human resources and operations focused staff, there's been an overhaul and also a really hearty documentation of the orientation process to bring staff on board. So we've been using Asana and other documentation to ensure that we're following through on that orientation process and that it is replicable going forward. So in that process, an additional need was identified to provide more kind of in-depth information sessions for new managers, as we had a new cohort of managers, quite a few of the total number starting within a 6 month to 1 year period. And by going through those info sessions and documenting the needs, the discussions, and debriefing on the questions that were asked, we now have also a replicable process for onboarding managers into the agency as well, with kind of special attention to their needs. The next bullet on this slide is about benefits. So we are continuing with MEPC's lead as the fiduciary agent to work on identifying ways to increase the attractiveness of working with the agency by improving the benefits that we offer to staff. And then also on this slide, we have been also working to continue to expand professional development opportunities. So for the rest of this year, we've identified an opportunity to provide additional effective supervision training in June. And then there'll be another module that we'll offer in the next state fiscal year. And we've also, as you'll see in the budget, we're planning to increase the overall travel and professional development in our budget next year, which is something we've been planning on doing in our strategic planning process. And then finally on this slide, there's a lot in this area. We had been focused on building up Asana practices. Asana is a kind of a project management tool and communication tool. We had a working group working for a period of time to develop common practices and training videos. And now we've been able to shift back to relaunching the project management working group, which will be looking for establishing more best practices around project management and recommendations for additional professional development. So that's the progress in the area around employee experience and retention. You can go to the next slide. This talks about board member priorities and experience. One of the goals was around having more hybrid or in-person opportunities. We did have 2 additional hybrid board meetings in the transportation boardroom. Those were in, I hope you all remember, March and April, when we were looking at funding scenarios for the TIP. If you'll recall, we had some pretty challenging conversations due to project delays and cost increases. And we received informal feedback from many of you that being in person and having printed materials for those conversations was really helpful, and that it was a nice opportunity for collaboration and relationship building. So we'll continue to try to strategize on when best to hold hybrid and in-person opportunities for you all. And then also the TIP process engagement and readiness committee, getting that going successfully was part of my goals. And it, of course, I think has been really successful and has really helped the full board meetings also go more smoothly. We did invest a significant amount of staff time, and I know you all as board members who participated invested a lot of time preparing for those meetings, attending those meetings, and really working to make sure that those were really productive and getting through them. And so I thank staff and all of you for making that committee quite successful so far, and I'm looking forward to continuing it. And then it has also been a pretty big lift internally for staff to bring together materials into a new board orientation package. You have not seen it yet. It has just been submitted and reviewed by the leadership team within the agency, and we're looking forward to launching that in the next state fiscal year. Next slide, please. So in the area of the goals around fiscal responsibility and opportunity, we've ended now, as again, you'll hear soon from Haral and Silva, 3 quarters with an estimated surplus, which we do want to keep to a minimum. We don't want to have either a significant surplus or deficit, but I think we've ended in a pretty good place so far throughout the year. So that has been going well. And the next bullet about the audit, we have begun to participate in the audit review that MEPC is responsible for initiating. So that's increased positive collaboration with our fiduciary. And then we also, as I mentioned earlier in response to Len's question, this year we were able to access and amend deobligated planning PL funds with an included MassDOT 20% match into our contract for this year. So those are the funds I mentioned that were allocated to the MPO in prior years, but were not used. Typically, that is due to staff shortages or other kinds of ways in which we were not able to fully realize all the work that we wanted to accomplish. And so those funds remain available to MPOs, typically through the federal regulations for 3 years after the initial year of obligation, and it rolls. And so that means that that balance can increase over time. So with what's been happening over the last number of years, that balance has been increasing for a number of MPOs in the state, and MassDOT worked collaboratively with us and with the other MPOs to talk about ways to spend down that balance this year. We still have not fully spent it down, and so we will be making another kind of request to work with MassDOT to find the matching funds to spend more money in the coming federal fiscal year. But just again to note, since MassDOT is supporting us by coming up with the matching funds, it is a significant ask from that agency and those state funds. And so that level of funding we're asking for may or may not be available. So we'll be looking forward to having the conversation, but just kind of recognizing what MassDOT is also bringing to the table to enable us to access those funds. And then finally, on this slide, we've gotten under contract legal support to help us through the process of seeking bids on alternative office spaces. So our goal is to have a lease with long-term certainty on our office space, whether it be in 10 Park Plaza or in another location. So we're working through the process now to develop the materials we need to get those out to bid and receive bids on different leases for office spaces. Next slide, there's just a couple more categories. In terms of sector leadership, there's, I think, a couple of really big celebrations in this area. They may not all be new, but we've reached a really important moment in terms of the first item here, the travel demand model, TDM 23. We have released TDM 23 and made it available for stakeholders, others who can work with and use travel demand models to use. So this is really an unprecedented model of using a model, where we have developed what we will be using for the next long range plan, but made it available to the broader community so that folks can use it, can understand it, can provide feedback about what is and isn't working about the use and application of the model. And it will help us kind of really expand the knowledge in the community and also improve it as we are applying it for the long range plan. So I like to think of it as sort of like taking the model out of the black box. And I'm really looking forward. So far, well, at least at the time of writing the memo, 12 organizations had requested and received the model for their use, and that included other MPOs, consultants working on projects for MassDOT and otherwise, and also universities who might use the model in their class curriculum. So it's incredibly exciting. And then also the next bullet, I think it's always really nice to highlight when a plan isn't just sitting on a shelf. We were very successful in doing the Blue Hills study, addressing equity and access in the Blue Hills. And we had been working with the MBTA in trying to get this to the point where they could pilot some of the recommendations in the result. And at a certain point, we hit a bit of a wall, but we have recently reconnected and we are seeing DCR and MBTA coordinating together to pilot a trimmed down version of one of the recommendations. So it's moving again, and that's a really exciting start to looking to implement aspects of that plan. And then the last bullet, we've actually had a variety of opportunities to have the work of the MPO highlighted sort of more broadly. So particularly some of the MPO presentations lately, like the roadway pricing study presentation and the MBTA community value studies, were picked up by press channels. And we were also recently interviewed by the Boston Globe because of that work. So it's very exciting to be able to get kind of the MPO, the Boston Region MPO, and its identity out there more to help people understand the important role that board members and staff play in the transportation planning process. And then last but not least, the next slide, thanks. The strategic plan implementation is sort of a catch-all. All the things I've been talking about really are associated with the strategic plan, but I also just wanted to call out a separate and important initiative that's underway. We have launched, it's been going on for a number of months, but the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Committee has really been underway to the point where they've now made some recommendations for doing some training, both for the committee as well as just kick off an assessment for the agency internally. And so we're getting to the point where that committee is now making recommendations and we're able to start implementing those recommendations. So that, next slide, please. That encompasses the updates that I wanted to share today. Again, the next steps are that the self-evaluation has been completed and the assessment is being carried out. And probably at the next meeting, I can both report on the full year as well as the goals established for state fiscal year 25, because we'll have completed that review by that time. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions or talk more about the process.
Well, Tegan, let me just start by applauding you and everyone involved for even getting this far. Getting this off the ground is in many ways the hardest part, and then it's sort of just continuation after this. But this is a huge lift. And when we started talking about this during the operations plan, I know there was a lot of trepidation from some parties, but I think you've proven that it is a good model, and I applaud you for your leadership and putting in the structures in place that are needed. While I have some nightmares still about Asana, I think it is a good way to do it. I think it keeps everybody involved. As long as you don't start doing Agile Scrum, I think I'll be okay. I have some nightmares from my time at the T on Agile Scrum. But I do have some questions specifically on some items, but I just wanted to preface that by saying that I think it's a great approach. And you sort of taken this from scratch and made it into something whole. So I applaud you for that. I do have some comments. Some of them tie into the budget discussion, but I'll just on this topic. I want to applaud you and Gina and everybody for really fighting for a long-term lease for the staff for your organization. It's important. I know that the 420K in the budget I think is a little high. But we can talk about that in the budget. But I do think the fact that you're looking for a long-term lease, whether it's in the transportation building or somewhere else, is a very positive step. And it's important for the overall health of the organization to just know sort of what to expect and have fixity of cost at the very least. So I definitely applaud that. And then just in general, you mentioned the work with DCR, the T. Obviously, the relationship with the T is incredibly important, and I think you've certainly nurtured that. I love the fact that we're working more with DCR, especially under the leadership of Brian Arrigo and Rob over there. They're starting to really try to be engaged, and I think they should be more engaged with the work of the MPO, and we should be more engaged with their work. They're a very important infrastructure owner and transportation provider, and I just wanted to again applaud you for working with them. I think they're your neighbors in 10PP, so that probably helps. But again, thank you. And I just think that speaks to the fact that you're trying to broaden the reach of the MPO and include more folks in the work that's being done. And the TDM sharing, I think, is another great example of that. I think in the past, it kind of would have been more curated or whatever the right word is, but I think by trying to spread it and the work of the organization, I think it's just spreading the knowledge that this great organization with incredibly smart, talented people exists and can be part of the solution to our transportation issues here in the Commonwealth. So thank you again. Leonard, I see your hand. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. And whereas Brian is very impressed with what you've done, I've come to expect nothing less. So, but still, I'm happy with what you've done. Like, what do you mean?
Touche, Leonard. Touche.
What do you mean? Just an A? What's with the? I'm expecting the A+. But anyways, no, good job, and I'm really happy to see the continued commitment to DEI. Because we all know that in some parts of the country, it's like they see it as a fad, and we see it as a long-term commitment, and you have to continually work on it. It's not one of those things that you can rest on your laurels. So I'm happy to see that. But to the staffing issue, I guess I had the sense that there's a target because there was a certain collection of skill sets that we wanted to have in an organization. And I thought maybe the consulting part of the budget was the flexible part, where if we needed either a certain kind of expertise that we didn't have on staff and would never want to have on staff, or we needed a little bit more, that was in the consulting part of it. So to say that it's flexible kind of makes me wonder, well, what skill sets are we maybe not having? And I guess my overall concern is that if we don't we try to have all those skill sets all the time. When we decide that we need them, it's kind of too late to go out and try to bring them in, because as you know, Tig, I mean, there's an onboarding process, and so I think you got my point.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Lynn. I completely agree with you. And I should be very clear that in maybe not setting a number as a goal does not mean that we're not being really thoughtful and planning and thinking about what staff we need. So we do have, first of all, we have a fixed sort of staffing plan that's an assumption for the year so that we can base our budgeting numbers on something. And right now that number is still a specific number of 61 staff. It assumes, you know, a broad range of skill sets across all the teams. And there are still some of those positions that are vacant that we are recruiting for. Then we also track who's coming and going throughout the year. And we have sort of an ongoing tracking system as somebody retires, for example. We have as we know somebody's going to retire, not after they retire, but 6 months leading up to a retirement, we start talking about the skill sets, transferring knowledge. We start talking about how we're going to hire to sort of fill gaps in skill sets, for example. So there's a lot of ongoing work that we're doing to build to the skill sets that we want and need at the agency. Sometimes it is resource allowing, like our goals might be loftier than our kind of baseline funding really allows for. So we definitely have a plan and we have goals, and we are working to fill those skill sets so that we can get our work done. I think that talking about a goal as in a fixed number, a target number of staff being 61 is maybe oversimplifying kind of the conversation in terms of what we're trying to accomplish at the agency. So I'd like to talk more about kind of the work, the skills that we need at the agency, and making sure we're fulfilling those needs, and not only be talking to you about, well, we have 54 out of 61 positions, because that may be perfectly fine right now. Or it may mean that we really have a big gap in some area that we're working to try to fill.
Gotcha.
I think your point is spot on, and I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Right, and it's so rare in government to have that strategic planning in place before someone leaves. It's really, usually you have to let them go, and only when they leave can you begin the process. So I think, this approach is really smart, and I applaud it as well. Anybody have any other questions on Tegan's report? She mentioned that David, Mark, and I are trying to get together. That's been like trying to plan a meeting of Congress or a launch of the space shuttle, but we think we have a date, and we'll have that conversation soon, and I expect it to go very well. So, any other questions for Tegan? Okay, then we'll move on to item 5, state fiscal year 24 year-end budget update, quarter 3. Haral and Silva, please go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning, everyone. Today, Silva and I will be presenting an update on the current state fiscal year through quarter 3, which is through March 30th of 2024. And we will also present the proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year, state fiscal year 2025, for discussion and your approval. So, let me just, before Silva gets started, I just wanted to kind of give a brief overview on the current fiscal year operating budget. We continue to see a surplus, as Tegan mentioned, which is aligned with our expectations, because throughout the year, we hold some of our expenses to see how the revenue and expenses are panning out. And then in quarter 3 and quarter 4, we tend to increase our expenses based on if there's a surplus or a deficit. And so in quarter 3, we expected to have a little more administrative expenses, but those have been kind of delayed to quarter 4. So we do anticipate our admin overhead to increase in quarter 4, and that's due to some of the hiring that we're doing on the admin team. We also do a lot, as an agency, we do our annual evaluations and performance assessments in April, and then we also are planning for a supervisory training in June. So there are certain things that will increase the overhead expenses in quarter 4. And Silva will provide more details on the expenses and the revenues in a little bit. We also plan on having, Silva will also present the year-end projections for fiscal year 24. And yeah, I'll hand it over to Silva now.
Thank you, Earl. Good morning, everyone. I will first start out by providing a summary of our financial standing through quarter 3. So looking at this table here, in quarter 3, we saw an increase in our revenue when compared to prior quarters, and our expenses remained relatively the same as last quarter. As a reminder, quarter 3 includes the months of January, February, and March, and these months are actually quite busy for staff because not only are they focused on their projects, but they're also busy with work scope development for the next fiscal year. So looking at our revenue row, we continue to see an increase as the quarter went on. Historically, our revenue is at its peak in quarter 3, so it's expected to see this continued increase. But I also want to mention that March, the last month of quarter 3, is one of the longer months of the year with no holidays, which resulted in more working days, and therefore we saw an increase in project charges. Now looking at our expenses row, as mentioned, it did not fluctuate as much when compared to last quarter. And before I get into the details, I want to share that during our last presentation, I had shared with you all that we were expecting a number of major expenses related to professional development opportunities to come through in quarter 3. Some of these expenses were DEI training for staff, project manager training, as well as hiring a consultant to help with recruitment. But all of these major items will now occur in quarter 4. We ended the quarter with a surplus, as Haral mentioned, but we do have a number of expenses occurring in quarter 4, such as the aforementioned professional development opportunities, but we're also hiring 2 more admin positions. We have our upcoming employee development plan, as well as our year-end performance assessments. So all of these examples will impact our admin expenses for quarter 4. Ideally, we would like our surplus and deficit row to be at 0. So we'll continue to monitor our revenue and expenses very closely in this last quarter. Overall, we ended the quarter with a total overhead rate of 111.63%. Okay, so this next slide here shows a graph of our projected revenue in blue, which, as a reminder, is a straight line projection versus our actual revenue in orange through quarter 3. As we see here, we have multiple categories for our revenue sources, including MPO and MassDOT directed PL funds, MassDOT SPR funds, MassDOT other projects, an MBTA category, and an other category. Looking at the overall graph itself, we notice that our overall highest funding source is the MPO and MassDOT directed PL category. So the straight line projection would indicate that we'd be at 4.3 million through quarter 3, and our actual charges have been closer to 4 million. So in other words, we've charged about 90% of what was expected by this time of year, which means we're actually on track to spend out our PL funds through the end of the year. Overall, the rest of our other funding categories have continued to increase from prior quarters, and we expect them to be on track through the end of the year. Looking at the far right column on the graph, in total, our revenue has been about 85% of what was expected through quarter 3, which really aligns with our expectations when compared to our expenses through quarter 3. Now, looking at the details of our expenses, our agency expenses are broken down into 3 categories, including admin expenses, direct labor, and direct costs. Looking at all three categories, we notice that our direct labor category is the closest to our straight line projection through quarter three, which aligns with our revenue due to staff work being at its peak in quarter three. Overall, looking at the far right columns, we charged about 83% of what we expected to through this time of year, which is very close to our revenue, and it shows that we have a balanced budget, which is what we expected through quarter three. Okay, our next slide here shows our year-end projections. We expect to end the year with our revenue at 7 million. And as for our expenses, we expect to end the year at 6.9 million. And finally, we expect our overhead rate to be at 118.28% for the end of the year. As always, we'll continue to closely monitor our revenue and expenses to ensure that we have a balanced budget by the end of the state fiscal year. Thank you all for your attention. And before I pass it on to Haral for next year's proposed budgets, are there any questions regarding the SFY 24 budget through quarter three?
Questions for Silva or Haral? I know that you folks watch this very closely, and it's always a challenge to kind of nail it to the penny. And I know you're working on it very hard, and I appreciate everything you're doing. It's amazing how the addition of a month without holidays can do what it does. But I think you're doing a great job as far as overseeing it. So, and looks like Eric agrees. So why don't we move on to the 25 budget?
Thank you. Next slide, please. So today I'll present the proposed state fiscal year operating budget. Next slide, please. Today we will, after I present, we can have a discussion, and the members can vote to recommend that the Boston Region MPO approve the state fiscal year 2025 operating budget for CTPS. This will be taken to the June 20th MPO meeting if it's approved today. Next slide, please. So there are three components to the operating budget: the revenue projections, anticipated expenses, and the provisional overhead rate. And I will be, throughout this presentation, I'll reference three documents that were linked in the meeting agenda, and also Scylla will be providing them in the chat box as we move through the presentation. The three documents are, actually there are two documents. One is the projected revenue table, and then the proposed operating budget memo and table are in one PDF. Next slide, please. So let's begin with the revenue projections for SFY 25. The projected revenue table provides a comprehensive breakdown of the anticipated funding sources. Next slide, please. The total revenue projections for SFY 25 are $8.5 million. Approximately $6 million of that is expected from MPO 3C planning funds, constituting about 70% of the total revenue. And this is consistent with previous years. Typically, we see about 70 to 75% of our funds come from the MPO funding. Then the remainder will likely derive from MassDOT, MBTA, and other grants and Roads for All. Next slide, please. Next, we can delve into the anticipated operating expenses. This table, which is part of, it's attached to the memo, outlines the expenses that we anticipate for next year. Next slide, please. Total anticipated expenses for SFY 25 are the same as the revenue assumptions, which is $8.5 million. These are categorized into three different categories, which are administrative expenses, direct labor, and direct costs. Next slide, please. So the administrative expenses comprise of the administrative expenses are about $4 million, which are about 47% of the total expenses. They encompass a range of operational tasks, including group collaboration, resource planning, budget, maintenance, strategic planning activities, and HR-related functions such as evaluations, training, and onboarding new employees. So if you can click through the bullet points, please. Thank you. This also covers employee benefits, IT equipment and software, office rent and maintenance, recruitment, and more. We do anticipate our expenses aligning with previous years, but I can also draw attention to some of the projected increases for the coming year. For instance, we've allocated an additional $100,000 in office rent that Brian mentioned earlier, and storage category to accommodate a potential increase due to the upcoming office space relocation. And that's in line 38 of the operating budget table. That is one of the line items that is unknown at this point. So we put a placeholder in there for $100,000 because we do not know right now what our lease will be in the coming year. And also that lease will probably include all the relocation expenses or build out of the office space or renovation of the current office space. So right now there's a placeholder, and we will most likely need to revise that number as we get more information. We're also proposing a budget increase for recruitment expenses to address the hiring needs of our specialized technical roles. We're considering engaging external hiring firms as reflected in line 40 of the operating budget table. And then another area where we anticipate increased expenditures is under line 44, professional services personnel. We're planning to enlist the services of a compensation consulting firm to revamp our current compensation plan, which was initially developed in 2021. While it has received minor updates throughout the years, it's due for a comprehensive refresh in this year. Next slide, please. So moving to direct costs, these expenses are directly associated with specific projects or contracts and typically require prior approval from MassDOT, our granting agency. These costs, classified as pass-through costs, do not affect the overhead rate. In state fiscal year 25, CTPS aims to collaborate with consultants on project-related tasks. An estimated $900,000 is earmarked for consultants assisting in implementing the Vision Zero work funded by the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant. This category also includes, so if you can click. It also includes IT equipment, project-related conferences and travel, ample membership dues, and incentives for public engagement, and other items such as translations for our certification documents and interpreters for public meetings. We are making a strategic investment, as Tegan mentioned earlier, in our staff for professional development. And one of the line items that we are increasing in this is project-related conferences and travel. We are hoping to send some more of our staff to these conferences that are out of state after the pandemic. I think during the pandemic, we lowered that line item, and every year we're hoping to increase it a little by little. Next slide, please. Finally, regarding the direct labor, based on revenue projections and our associated work plan, we anticipate having 61 professional positions consistent with this year's projected staffing levels. The total cost for direct labor related to contracts is projected to be about $3.4 million. We currently have a staff count of 54 and actively recruiting for 4 positions. Additionally, we anticipate advertising 2 more positions in the upcoming weeks. Next slide, please. So this slide provides the state fiscal year 25 projected overhead rate overview. we determine our overhead rate by dividing our annual administrative expenses by our direct labor, resulting in an overhead rate of 120.3%, which matches the current state fiscal year projected overhead rate. Even though we're gonna end at, most likely will end between 115 and 118%. We're not changing the projected overhead rate for state fiscal year 2025. So that concludes my presentation on the proposed SFY 25 operating budget. Thank you for your attention and considering the proposed budget. Now I'll hand it over to you, Mr. Chair, to lead the discussion and address any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Sorrel. Yeah, I'm more of a table than a chair, but thank you. I do have some questions, but I want to open it up to everybody else because I feel like I've talked a lot. So, any other members have any questions for Haral Silva about the FY 25 budget? All right, I'll go then. So just quickly, what's the difference between item number 5 on the budget and 46, 47, 48? So one is like travel project and one is just like travel.
So that's a good question. So 46 is the summary of 47 and 48. That's the total.
Yeah.
But because that was a little bit that was like in the gray area, the 47 and 48. If you notice in state fiscal year 25, we're actually combining those two because there wasn't really a distinguishing element to where we were charging our conference and travel versus travel and mileage reimbursement. And so we've combined that in state fiscal year 25 into one line item, but basically that encompasses any admin related travel. If anyone from the leadership team is going to a conference or part of the leadership team, executive leadership team, they would be charging that line or that expense would be charged to this line item in 47 versus in line 5, it would be any project related expenses. So staff traveling to TRB, for example, or MassDOT Innovations Conference, any of the project related conferences get charged to line 5.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I just had to check. Obviously, travel is up quite a bit. You mentioned it was down because of COVID, and I think it's coming back to where it should be. So that's always something to watch. I noticed you did zero out mileage in 48. Is that just going to be ruled into 47? Is that the plan? Okay,
Exactly.
that makes sense. And then consultants, I know you talked about this, but it's up 304%. Obviously, my preference, and maybe not everybody agrees with this, is to have more in-house expertise. I know that's not always possible, and Leonard talked about the flexibility that comes with third parties from time to time. But I hope that the CTPS doesn't get stuck in the consultant industrial complex that the T seems to be stuck in, and unable to do anything without them. You guys are really smart and more than capable. So that's my 2 cents on that. And then just under employee costs, do we pay PFMLA or is that rolled into the Massachusetts line item?
That is part of our line 11 PTO benefits. We have we work with MAPC on our benefits, and we offer benefits for FMLA that are either equivalent or better than the PFMLA benefit.
Yeah, I think it's a new state requirement that we have to pay it. So I know I'm putting it in my budget last year, and it's hard to calculate because they won't tell you what the rate is. Anyway, Tegan, go ahead, please.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just wanted to go back to the consultant comment, Brian, because I think, I do agree with your comment. I think it's really important that we have in-house strong skills. The way we use consultants right now, I think is pretty strategic and I think works. It's typically more for the one-off efforts that are really kind of outside of the core MPO work. So Haral mentioned that, some of this is for a compensation consultant, right? Like that's not expertise we want to have on our staff. And another way in which we're really beginning to use consultants more is as we've been looking at grant opportunities. So granted, in the Safe Streets and Roads for All opportunity, we do a lot of work in analysis and safety and public engagement. However, it's a one-time kind of large influx of funds. And so if we were to do all of that work on staff, we would either have to bring in a lot of staff that we may not then be able to fund 2 years down the line, or we would have to repurpose people off of existing kind of MPO work. So that's a case where we might have to bring in additional expertise that might overlap with our own, but that's because of the timing of the grants. So those are the ways in which we're using consultants, but I agree with you. I do not want to start to sort of sacrifice that internal expertise and ability to maintain kind of continuity and consistency in the work that we do.
Fantastic, Tegan. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? If not, is there a motion to recommend approval to the full MPO for the state fiscal year 25 operating budget for CTPS as presented?
Eric Bourassa, I will make that motion.
Is there a second?
Derek Cravat, second.
Derek
You got it, Derek. Good job. Silva, you want to call the roll, please?
Yes, Brian Kane,
Yes.
Dennis Giambetti,
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
Eric Bourassa,
Eric Bourassa, yes.
Leonard Diggins,
Diggins, yes.
and Derek Cravat.
Derek Cravat, yes.
Motion carries, Mr. Chair.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And given that it's 9:59, is there a motion to adjourn?
I will also make that motion.
Well, hey, without
member-
objection. Thanks,
My
Leonard.
member
Without
seconded.
objection,
Second.
we're going to be
Good job,
adjourned.
staff and everyone. Really.
Thanks, everybody.
what's going on.
Yeah, stay
Great
dry
job,
today.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.